Here we are again then with a video explaining the question about the purges and about the reasons why Stalin retained power. You've obviously got to understand the meaning of the word retained. It means why Stalin stayed in power, why Stalin was able to remain in power. So you've also got to know about the purges. You've got to know about what is included in this title and what's not. We spent a little bit of time defining the purges, collectivization and the campaign against the kulaks, or the 5-year plans, for example, are not the same thing as the purges. So you've got to be clear before you start writing on what is included and what's not covered by this term. Here again is the clip from the mark schedule, so you could pause the video, have a look at it, make sure you've understood it, make sure that there's see whether there's anything you disagree with or anything that you think you ought to include as well as what's here. The question though is asking you about the reasons why Stalin stayed in power. You'll find this in our booklet on page 162 to 3, and if you haven't done this work, then I'd suggest you take a look at it before you go into the exam for the real thing. I would say that the purges are pretty important as far as reasons for Stalin staying in power go, and so you might include a couple of paragraphs on the purges and how they helped him to stay in power. But they're not the only reasons, and you might actually decide, having looked at it, that one of these other coloured reasons deserves a bit more space. That would be down to you, I think, but those are broadly the things that you ought to be covering, the factors that you ought to be covering in this essay. If you're covering those factors, the factor in the question plus 3 or 4 others, then you're probably going to be showing a good understanding and writing a balanced essay. If you're covering 4 or 5 paragraphs, then you're probably writing a relevant argument on an analytical approach, and it's going to be balanced. If you answer the question in the first sentence, you're probably going to be writing analytically, and you're probably going to be reaching or implying some kind of judgment, even if you're not doing it very strongly or very confidently. If you have got 3 detailed examples per paragraph, you're probably, as long as they're detailed enough and as long as they actually prove what you want them to prove, you're probably supporting your argument well enough. And if you write an introduction and a conclusion, you're probably going to be getting credit for a judgment, which puts everybody in level 4, which is a good thing. But if you want to get into level 5, you do need to be slightly better than this. And you need to have decided on your argument before you start writing. So everything that we've just said about level 4 still applies, but you also need to be thinking about these things. To what extent were the purges the most important reason? And this is where I think it starts to get quite interesting. So think about the categories. You're already going to be doing this, and so you could just choose a category and say, actually, this is the most important reason. That's fine. That probably would get you up to 24, 25, as long as everything else is good. Think, though, about the chronology of it. You could think about the different purges or the different groups of people purged, and I've made a suggestion here on how you might organise it, but you could organise it differently. But if you understand the purges, then you know that they're really only important between 1936 and 1939. The purges of the parties, certainly, you could say it began earlier than that at the 1934 17th Party Congress. But we don't get any show trials and we don't get any major figures removed until 1936. The Purge of the Armed Forces is 38-39. Purge of Society is 37-38-39. So they're certainly important in that period. What about before then? Can we argue that the purges were important in the 1920s? Well, purges had been important in the 1920s, but did they keep Stalin in power then? I don't know if they did. What about some of these other things? Stalin's control of the party. Well, that had been important since 1922. It helped him get into power. Did it help him stay in power? It did. Stalin's popularity? Well, it's difficult to know because we're not quite sure how popular Stalin really was. But the lack of an alternative, which could be part of Stalin's popularity, that's certainly a reason why Stalin retained power. And that's certainly been going on since the early 1920s when Stalin won the leadership struggle. Stalin had also ensured that the party had control of the state. In fact, Lenin had ensured that the party had control of the state. Was that important during the purges period, 34, 36, 39? No, these other factors go way back before the purges. So when was it that Stalin created the means for retaining power? Well, arguably, that predated the purges by 10 years or so. So were the purges the most important reason why Stalin retained power? No. The reasons why Stalin retained power date back to the early 1920s, mid-1920s. You could also think about this. When was Stalin at risk of losing power? Well, he was at risk of losing power before he was securely in power by 1928. Then again, 32 to 34, think of the backlash against collectivization, think of the Ryutin platform, think of the popularity of Kirov in 1934. Stalin was at risk of losing power at that stage. Then, was he really at risk of losing power from 1936 to 1939? All his opponents really had been defeated by 1937. Maybe there's a threat of losing power from the armed forces in 1938, 1939, but there's not much evidence that he was really at risk. So when was he most at risk of losing power? It's the early 1930s, probably. So were the purges the most important reason why he retained power? Maybe, but actually probably the threat had already passed before the purges began. The way he was able to manipulate the party at 1934 Party Congress suggests that actually Stalin retained power because he was devious and willing to manipulate party rules to keep himself in positions, and because he was surrounded by loyal supporters, not because he was willing to shoot people. So the chronology suggests that the purges were important after 1936, but other factors had been important long before then. And so chronology gives you a useful angle for your argument here. You can argue, I think, that the purges were important for making sure that Stalin retained power after 1936, but that in fact other factors were much more important in the long run. You should also think about contingency. Now, I've picked one here. You might disagree. You might choose a different one. But I think I might argue that Stalin retained power for various reasons, most of which dated back long before the purges. And actually, his ability to retain power was contingent upon his control of the party, because without that, he wouldn't have been able to maintain his popularity, to influence the direction of the state, to control party and state organizations, and therefore without those things he wouldn't have been able to use the purges to remove his opponent either. So I think that's how I would argue it. Now, obviously, you need to have thought all of this through, at least before you start writing your conclusion. So if you have time, I would always say 1 minute sitting back, thinking about the big picture, thinking about these three C's of categories, chronology and contingency, is probably worth more. That 1 minute thinking about the three C's is probably worth more than 1 minute writing a conclusion. Some of you wrote quite long conclusions which didn't say as much as they could have done because you hadn't really done the thinking beforehand. So sit back, think, take a breath, take a minute to think, and then write a shorter conclusion which uses those keywords, chronology or those key ideas perhaps, chronology and contingency, and I hope that helps.